Thanks everyone so much for coming to today's book launch of The Means of Reproduction by Michelle Goldberg. We're thrilled to have you all here. My name is Gib Clark. I am the coordinator of the Global Health Initiative and the senior program associate with the Environmental Change and Security program here at the Wilson Center, the two programs that are putting this event on today. For those of you new to the Wilson Center, I'll just tell you quickly about it. For those who have heard this a million times, I apologize. Maybe you can say it with me, but basically the Wilson Center was established in 1968 as the official living memorial to President Wilson, as he was our only president with a PhD. The idea is to bring the world of academia and the world of policy together, and so there's no monument on the Mall or any place else. This is it. We're really excited about this event. I and I know several of my colleagues here really enjoyed reading this book. It brings to mind a few things that don't always occur to me at the same time. For example, I found myself telling people that this was a reproductive rights page-turner, which doesn't make sense to a lot of people. But I think if you look through the book, you'll probably agree with me. It also takes some of the people in the reproductive health community that many of us know and turns them into real characters. And obviously, in some cases, I'm assuming that's fairly easy, but in some cases, maybe it was a little harder. But more than anything, and especially considering that we're here at the Wilson Center, nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization, is that it takes a look at these really difficult issues in an extremely even-handed, well-researched way. No one is off limits for either congratulations or let's say encouragement to do better. A really enjoyable book, and I encourage you all to look through it. They're available outside for sale. Maybe Michelle will stick around for a little while and sign some copies. So we'll first hear from Michelle. She is a journalist and author based in New York. In addition to this book, she is the author of Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism, and she is a senior correspondent for The American Prospect, a contributing editor at Religion Dispatches, and her work has appeared in a wide variety of newspapers and publications, both in the U.S. and abroad. And next we'll hear from Carol Peasley, who is the president and CEO of CEDPA, the Center for Development and Population Activities. She served for more than 30 years at USAID, where she held several senior positions both here in Washington and as mission director in Malawi and the Russian Federation. I'm cutting both of those bios very short. In the handout outside, there's a lot more on both of them. One final note before we begin, you'll notice there's a camera in the back. And that is because we're webcasting this event both live, and then we'll have it up in about a week or so on archived format. So when we get to the Q&A, please wait for a microphone to come around and let us know who you are so that our viewers at home can do the same. So with that, I'll hand off to Michelle.
Hey, thank you so much for coming out here today. So my book is both a series of kind of interlocking narratives and an argument. The argument, or the kind of underlying argument throughout the book, is that women's rights are both the central human rights struggle of the 21st century. And while I know there's we were talking earlier that I know there's no such thing as a magic bullet in development, women's rights and women's empowerment are about as close as it comes. There are so many kind of interlocking catastrophes and onrushing disasters that just cannot be addressed unless you take women's rights seriously. Now, reproductive rights, which is what I focus on in this book, and this book is about the global battle for reproductive rights, the global battle over reproductive rights, are not obviously the whole of women's rights. Women's rights also includes the right to an education, the right to livelihood, the right to own property. But in ways that I try to show in this book, reproductive rights have been both the kind of major center of contention, the places where we see kind of actually great global battles between world powers, you know, the Vatican, blocks of Islamic states, the United Nations, fighting over basically, as I say in the title, who controls the means of reproduction. And it's also, they are also a precondition for so many other aspects of women's rights and women's livelihoods. You know, you can't have an education if you drop out of school because you get pregnant as a teenager, or if you're married off when you're 13. You know, you can't have a livelihood if you have 9 children. Maternal mortality, as we know, is both a kind of international source of shame. It's kind of international disaster, and it also exerts a huge burden on government health services all over the world that's completely unnecessary. You know, we're so used to thinking about, or at least I was so used to thinking about the abortion issue in particular as being the quintessential American culture war issue. And one thing you really realize as you start traveling around is that not only does American abortion policy and American kind of sexual politics have a greater impact on the life and health of women worldwide than it does here at home, but you also start to see that some of the issues that have become abstract here because of Roe versus Wade and because of the protections that we've enjoyed for the last several decades, the idea of, or, you know, the concept of unsafe abortion, while being a horrifying one to many people of my generation, is also a very abstract one. And when you travel around the world, it's not at all abstract. You know, there are hospitals in East Africa where most of the women who are coming into the emergency section of the OBGYN wards are there for botched abortions. There are doctors in these wards who spend most of their time dealing with the fallout of unsafe abortion. You know, according to the World Health Organization, unsafe abortion is responsible for 13% of maternal mortality worldwide. And that's pretty widely understood to be, at least by those in the field, to be probably an underestimation. And there's countries in East Africa, for example, where the real figure is closer to 30%. And so again, while reproductive rights is not the magic bullet for eliminating or, you know, bringing third world maternal mortality to the kind of levels that we have in the United States or even better in Western Europe, there are very few other aspects of women's health that can be so easily, that are so subject to politics, you know, that can be so easily addressed by passing a law as opposed to building massive new infrastructure. Not that we shouldn't be building massive new infrastructure. I think we clearly should be. And then beyond that, you have the issue of contraception, the issue of birth spacing, the issue of forced marriage. All of these things contribute to when and how many children women give birth to, and thus how safe their deliveries are. There's a big difference to a woman's body between giving birth at 14 and giving birth at 22. And there's a big difference between giving birth 10 months after your last child and 3 years after your last child. And while all of these are in many cases, you know, public health problems, they're also political problems. And the reason that they haven't been addressed as well as they could be, is in many cases as much an issue of politics as it is of resources. And so the story that I try to tell in this book, or the kind of interlocking series of stories I try to tell, actually starts in the Cold War. And it's interesting because, you know, if you grew up as I did thinking about abortion and women's rights being this kind of culture war football, it's kind of amazing to learn that it was actually these very clean-cut, buttoned-up national security pillars of the establishment who were very much obsessed with bringing contraception to the third world in the 60s and early 70s. I mean, basically, after World War II, you had a population explosion in large parts of the developing world because all of a sudden you had, this influx of antibiotics and various kind of public health measures, and so a big drop in the death rate without a corresponding drop in the birth rate. And there was suddenly this kind of Malthusian panic. It became, an issue. Someone compared it to me to being like global warming today, which is a misleading comparison. I'm certainly not trying to downplay the problem of global warming, but it's comparable only in that it was that much of a topic of public conversation and public concern. It was, an issue that leaders of the free world, were compelled to opine about. And at one point, you actually had Dwight Eisenhower and Harry Truman serving together as co-chairmen of Planned Parenthood, which is, would be kind of inconceivable today. And so you were getting all of these news stories and pamphlets arguing that overpopulation was going to cause so much misery in the developing world that it was going to lead to communist revolution. And so the only way to save capitalism was essentially to shower the developing world with contraception and to do everything possible to bring down birth rates. And although I think that these programs, which basically created the infrastructure for kind of global family planning as we know it today, these programs, vastly changed women's lives, and I would argue became ultimately a tool for liberation, but were not really intended that way at all, and occasionally treated women as kind of mere means to a preferred demographic destiny. So you had a number of women, it was, initially it was all men running these things, but then you had some women who were kind of coming up through the ranks who gradually became very disillusioned with the way that women were spoken about in these programs as kind of wombs or, contraceptive acceptors. There was a lot of emphasis on permanent methods that were difficult for the woman themselves to reverse because they were thought to be, somewhat untrustworthy. There was, problems with IUDs being inserted in places where women didn't necessarily have access to the follow-up care to remove them. So gradually the women who are coming up through these institutions kind of took them over from within. And this is interesting too, because in speaking of strange bedfellows, and there's a lot of strange bedfellows in this story, in 1993, there was an Earth Summit in Cairo. And at the time, the feminist forces were so opposed to the forces of family planning and population control that the narrative coming out was that the feminists in the Vatican were united against family planning. I mean, try to imagine that today. And so, but eventually there was women who did understand that family planning was an important component of development, of kind of larger, demographic policy, but also of women's lives and women's empowerment. They took over these institutions, and there was a kind of classic long march through the institutions that culminated in a conference at Cairo. And that conference at Cairo, which was 15 years ago, and there's a lot of, 15-year anniversary of Cairo kind of conferences and discussions and things going on now. But that conference kind of set the stage for what's basically been the battleground to some extent since then. Because at Cairo we saw, as feminists kind of took over the infrastructure, and a globalized feminist network kind of emerged to try to push women's rights internationally, a globalized fundamentalist network emerged in response. And I've always believed, my first book was about religious fundamentalism in American politics. I've always believed that fundamentalists across religious lines have more in common with each other than they do with the liberals in their own societies. I would argue that we in this room have far more in common. I think it's kind of obvious that we in this room have at least, well, I certainly wouldn't say that we have, I certainly wouldn't claim their bravery for themselves. I would say that we share the ideals of many of the women who are marching on the streets, who've been marching on the streets of Tehran. And I would also argue that there are certain people in American political life whose values don't differ in any substantial way from those of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And what was fascinating about Cairo was to see the religious forces realize this. Because essentially you had the Vatican kind of panic about the idea that there was going to be an international consensus in favor of women's rights. And so the Vatican, realizing it didn't have a lot of allies in Europe or at the time in the United States, reached out to Libya and Iran and the various Muslim states to try to form this kind of united front. And there was a statement at the time made by the deputy foreign minister of Iran that I think is very true and that remains very true. And it was, the future war is between the religious and the materialists. Collaboration between religious governments in support of outlawing abortion is a fine beginning for the conception of collaboration in other fields. And so essentially, you have, when it comes to women's health and reproductive rights, and this certainly doesn't apply to many other issues where there's obviously considerable and kind of epochal tensions between Christian fundamentalists and Muslim fundamentalists, or Western conservatives and conservatives in Asia and the Middle East. But on this particular issue, you've had a pretty consistent block at the United Nations against the expansion of women's rights, against the expansion also of international law protections for reproductive rights. One of the things that came out of Cairo ended in a declaration which almost all of the governments of the world signed on to, and although these declarations aren't enforceable and they're not international law, they shape the way international law is understood and interpreted, and they also shape, the policies of these kind of various international agencies. And one of the things that's so complicated about these stories is that the whole world of international law and international agencies and international diplomacy can be so recondite and seem so divorced from anything with any kind of tangible reality on the ground. It's so soaked in jargon. It's kind of indecipherable to outsiders. I always say that, people in the field get all upset and say, oh my God, there's no SHRH in the MDGs. And trying to convince anybody, even a person who's relatively engaged, why they should possibly care about that is very difficult, which is one reason I actually think there's somewhat of a disconnect between this huge international field where there's all of these actually very consequential battles being fought and the world of kind of mainstream political discussion. As I was writing this book and as I've been talking about it, when I say I've written a book about the global battle over reproductive rights, people have no idea what that means. And, so part of the aim of this book is just to show that there is a global battle over reproductive rights. We've been in a situation, really starting with Reagan, where the United States is either the most powerful member of a kind of axis of religious conservatism and religious traditionalism standing against reproductive rights and against the expansion of women's rights at the United Nations, or else it's the most powerful force of a group of nations that's trying to expand access to reproductive rights. I don't know if there's anything else, from one administration to the next, if you're very poor, it's a different story. But for most women, your kind of access to health services and your day-to-day life and the rights that you enjoy, as much as you might be outraged from one administration to the next, your life doesn't usually change in profound and appreciable ways. But it's very different internationally. Republicans come in, a whole string of clinics close, money's cut off, other people, money flows into religious charities, et cetera, et cetera. Democrats come in, it kind of, to some extent, reverses. I mean, the changes from administration to administration are quite profound. And yet, and then also, we've increasingly seen, building on Cairo and building on a whole host of other kind of international treaties and international arrangements, we've seen reproductive rights move into the realm of international law. So there's been a series of cases where countries that have denied women medically necessary abortions have been taken to international tribunals, including the European Court of Human Rights, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and there's either been settlements or judgments that have ruled that they violated women's rights and that these women are entitled to monetary redress. This is kind of a new thing in the world, the idea that women's rights to some extent trump national sovereignty, and that there's a limit to how much countries can limit their own people's access to reproductive rights. And as you could imagine, it brings up some of the same tensions that attach to Roe versus Wade, right? Just as Roe versus Wade created a backlash in, as much as it was rightly decided, in my opinion, it creates this automatic backlash in communities and states that feel like their own ability to regulate their own members, their ability to set their own norms, to create their own culture, has been undermined by these outside, impersonal, and kind of unaccountable forces. So, now you kind of have that at the international level, where you have a country like Poland or Peru being told you cannot ban abortion in this complete way. And as a result, you have this strange new growth of what I would call, right-wing anti-colonialism, where you basically have right-wing groups saying that one way to defy the West and to protect our own culture against the kind of depredations of globalization is to enforce these very strict conceptions of gender roles, and to, these very strict kind of traditional religious teachings, or very strict, very strict cultural norms. And what's fascinating is that just as the kind of feminist movement has globalized, and just as the left-wing anti-globalization movement has become an international phenomenon, so too has the right-wing, what I'd call kind of right-wing anti-colonialism, so that there are now, for example, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, there was a big meeting in Abuja, Nigeria, organized by a number of American right-wing groups who increasingly are organizing globally. They have something called the World Congress of Families, which happens every 2 years, and it's an international conference of fundamentalists, conservatives, social traditionalists. It's kind of an amazing thing. I went in Poland in 2007, and you see, it's in a dark way kind of vision of global harmony, Christians and Muslims and evangelicals and Mormons and Catholics from all over the world joining hands against the true enemy, which is feminists and liberals and secularists, which is the part that's like slightly less utopian. But, so there was a meeting in Abuja, Nigeria, to try to take advantage of the fact that there's such an emergent Pentecostal movement in Africa.
Oh.
Wow. And there's some of them out there flickering the lights, and and so you're increasingly seeing, kind of the language of like African nationalism being expressed in, the idiom of the American right-wing culture wars. And there's going to be another big international meeting in Amsterdam this summer. One thing, I'll end by saying, one thing that I tried to do in this book is, on the one hand, to zoom out and talk about these international politics and this kind of sweeping international story, but also to zoom in and show why it matters, and why some kind of obscure bit of diplomatic jargon hashed out in a conference room in Cairo, or, some kind of American objection to a provision in a treaty, that most people have never heard of, why that actually has an impact on a woman's life in, say, a village in Kenya or in a city in Latin America. And, a couple of years ago, Nicaragua decided to ban all abortion, even when a woman's life is at stake. And it was kind of in response to this local cause celeb over this young girl named Rosa, a 9-year-old girl who had been raped and was pregnant and eventually got an illegal abortion, and it became a huge national kind of media circus, and it really outraged the right. And in response, they launched this campaign with substantial help from some American groups that are affiliated with some of the local Nicaraguan groups. And eventually Daniel Ortega, who had been a Sandinista, but had been, is a Sandinista, but who very much had betrayed the women who fought with him in the revolution initially, decided that, in his desperate bid to reclaim power, he would side with these forces and kind of promise, if they would support him, to pass this total blanket abortion ban in a country where abortion was already severely, severely restricted. And the language was all about these outside Western groups trying to undermine Nicaraguan culture, trying to push us around, trying to impose their decadent, their kind of decadent materialistic morality on us in Nicaragua. There was kind of consistent targeting of feminist groups that were getting foreign funding, and basically it was almost, just as you had kind of proxy wars fought on Nicaraguan soil in the 80s between communism, and capitalism, or this communism in the United States. Now you had this kind of proxy war with support from both sides, support from the church and from groups in the United States on one side, and from the European feminist groups in the United Nations on the other side. And it's ended in this kind of catastrophic situation where you now have women, bleeding to death in Nicaraguan hospitals, being left untreated, or being left to wait for their fallopian tubes to burst before they can be treated for an ectopic pregnancy. I mean, it's maternal mortality doubled in the year after this law was passed. And eventually this is going to end up in the Inter-American, it's incredibly likely that eventually this is going to end up before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and it's going to be yet another step in this kind of growing amorphous body of international human rights law. And so, which again is going to set off a whole new realm of struggle about who has the right, who ultimately in a kind of globalized world has the right to make decisions about about community mores on sex and gender and reproduction. There's a lot more, but I'll end there, and then Carol can talk, and then we can take questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Michelle. Go ahead, Carol.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I'm honored to be here today, but I'm also a bit intimidated as I'm not an expert in reproductive health, reproductive rights, family planning, or women's empowerment. But I'm an economist by training and a development generalist by background. But I can say that I care passionately about women's rights and reproductive health. And since becoming the CEO of CEDPA, the Center for Development and Population Activities, in October this past year, I've learned a tremendous amount about the debates that are outlined in Michelle's book. And also, as Gibb said, I had a very lengthy career with USAID, and during that time I visited countless family planning clinics, saw community-based distribution of contraceptives up close, and heard the stories of scores of women, both those who were receiving services and those who were negatively affected by the lack of service and that their needs weren't being met. And I also saw personally the effects of too many young women who died in childbirth or because of miscarriages and unsafe abortions. And I still, when I picked up the book, I could remember 1972 or so standing outside Beer Hospital in Kathmandu when one of my Nepali colleagues, his wife had just died during childbirth. And, although I think it was never clear to me whether it was a miscarriage or a botched abortion. He used the term abortion, but I never did understand. But I have this sort of visual image of that. Anyway, today what I'd like to do is talk about just a few comments in three general areas. First, some comments directly related to the book. Second, a few personal observations. And then third, just a few concluding thoughts on the debate. But most importantly, I want to congratulate Michelle on a wonderfully written book. As Gibb mentioned, seeing the subject matter, I didn't expect it to be a page-turner, but it is, and I do highly recommend it for those of you who have not read it. It is very readable, it's engaging, and it's very difficult to put down. It's a wonderful history and a description of the debates that have taken place in the U.S. and globally over the past 40 years or so, and in some ways, if one wants to include Malthus, probably centuries of debate. So it's again a wonderful history. And again, I think what makes it particularly special is the extraordinary job she has done of bringing many personal stories to the book, and it's women who've been affected by FGM, by botched abortions, and poor health services. And you really feel as if you've met these women, and their stories come to life. And you've therefore, I think, brought the voices of many, many women to this debate. And it's really, as we all know, their voices are the most important ones to be heard. I think you've candidly and also clearly laid out some of the most sensitive issues that have affected the global debate. And I wanted to just highlight two particular issues that I thought I was really impressed with the way you handled them in the book. First was UNFPA, the UN Population Fund, and China's one-child policy, and then the discussion on sex selection abortion. On the first of these, I think you made very clear that UNFPA did not support China's one-child policy, and even you cite them bringing an internationally respected demographer to China to point out to officials the implications of a policy that would lead to too few young people supporting too many elderly people, and that it didn't make sense demographically. But even while acknowledging that UNFPA did do this, and also while acknowledging the great work that UNFPA has done for many years around the world, I think the book also makes it very clear that UNFPA was publicly silent in speaking out against China's one-child policy. And you talk, the book talks about how this silence was exacerbated by a very politically unastute decision to give the first UN Population Award in 1983 to Chiang Ching-shong, the architect of the one-child policy, and to Indira Gandhi, who had overseen mandated sterilization in India. And I'll quote from the book, quoting, "By condoning coercion, the UNFPA seemed to prove the most vehement critics of international family planning correct. The charges against the agency would continue to stick decades later, even after it had thoroughly reformed itself." And I think through her candor, Michelle provides a good basis to move on from the arguments of the 1980s. By attributing some fault to UNFPA, I think you provide greater credibility to the arguments of the many positive contributions made by the organizations. And perhaps this type of balanced reporting will help UNFPA gain the bipartisan support it deserves in the United States. Similarly, in the sensitive discussion on sex selection, I believe the book can help to build bridges between those who support and those who pillage reproductive health. On page 187, and again I'd like to quote from the book, it candidly notes that, quote, "To confront the issue of sex-selective abortion as a feminist is to see the world in much the same way pro-lifers do, at least for a moment. It's to look in horror at a culture where potential life is tossed away in the quest for economic advancement and status, debasing all involved. It's to see some choices as illegitimate," end of quote. And again, I think this kind of candor and sensitivity can help to improve understanding and civil dialogue, and hopefully build some common sense views that respect the rights of women to choose. And as one who's not been at the center of this debate over the past 30, 40, however many years, I so want to see common sense come to the fore and have people discuss these issues in a rational way and to get rid of some of the emotionalism. And I do think that kind of objective reporting and pointing out issues is very important and a valuable contribution. As I mentioned earlier, I think the book is beautifully written, and like all good stories, it has heroes or heroines. I don't know if the word heroine, is it politically correct to use that term? And
I
don't
think
know.
it is.
It is? Okay, because I know with actors and actresses, I guess you don't say actress anymore. You're supposed to say actors. But anyway. And villains. And I think Michelle correctly cites a number of important leaders, women like Joan Dunlop and Adrienne Germain. And I, too, applaud their extraordinary leadership and agree that they deserve the highest recognition. But in citing a few, we need to remember there were many. And as the CEO of SEDPA, I'd like to publicly acknowledge another important leader, and that's Peggy Kurlan, who was one of the founders of SEDPA in the 1970s and served as president from 1989 to 2003. Peggy also was a heroine. She played a major role in reframing the population response, organizing the largest delegation of women from the Global South to participate in the ICPD meetings in Cairo and to advocate for a woman-centered approach. She made a significant difference there as well as earlier in her career in Bangladesh when she worked with local Bangladeshi women, ensuring that women were at the center of the community-based approaches that were very successful in Bangladesh. So I just wanted to add a heroine to the list. And now to the villains. They're always more fun. And there's one, and I'm going to mention, and as a longtime USAID person, I feel it's okay for me to mention Ravin Holt, because he stands out as one of the major ones, although the book also makes it clear about his strong commitment and even the significant results that he achieved, which also put him on the hero side as well. He was a very complex individual. And I think the book does a great job of outlining that complexity. In a mixed feeling, I must confess that I also share. I was introduced to international family planning programs, or to USAID's family planning programs, by Dr. Ravin Holt in 1970, the spring of 1970, when I first joined USAID, and I was in an international development intern class. I was one of 15. I was one woman of. There were 15 of us, the only woman in the class, and we had a lot of meetings. And when we met with Dr. Ravin Holt, he was truly outrageous. When my male colleagues were all very super sensitive 60s, 70s guys, and they were all expressing concerns about passing out pills, inserting IUDs without adequate health, without doctors and all of this. And he dismissed them all with the rudest comments that I have ever heard, and particularly about rude comments about women. He just kept saying, these women in these developing countries, he said, they're not all overweight. They're out there working all the time. They're not going to be affected by these things. And I remember sitting there thinking, this is what he thinks about women. So I knew I was quite outraged by it. I really kind of sat in disbelief. And so I can understand why he was such a controversial figure in the movement. But I do also think that we need to recognize some of the contributions he made. And I do think that without his personal commitment and leadership, investments in family planning would not have been as great, and results would have been far less. And again, I think I just wanted to cite one statistic from a publication that was just written over the past year by 5 former directors of the USAID Office of Population, not including Dr. Ravin Holt, I might add. But they did a publication making the case. And the statistic that really jumped out at me was that between 1965 and 2005, the use of family planning by women of reproductive age in the developing world, excluding China, because many of these figures, when we look at development, include China and distort everything, but excluding China, rose from less than 10% to 53%. And the actual numbers grew from 30 million users in the early 60s to 430 million in 2008. And those are, I think, incredibly significant numbers. And I do think the early leadership of Dr. Ravin Holt was important. I'd also just briefly note 2 other features of the Ravin Holt approach that I would suggest that those in the field might want to further look at. first, his inundation strategy, which was pouring contraceptives into countries, in many ways could have been a stimulus to community-based approaches that many of us applaud today. He didn't care whether doctors or health systems or clinics were involved. Community volunteers were fine for him. And so, in a sense, did inundation have a perverse positive effect in that it provoked innovation at the community level? And I just raised that as a question. I have no idea. Secondly, although Dr. Ravin Holt was driven by the macro demographic concerns, by population control as a concern, and I would again remind people that, and Michelle talked about this as well, that the discussion of population in the 60s and at least into the early 70s, the concerns about population growth, the concerns about global food security. There was a big Club of Rome meeting, I remember, in the early 70s in which they projected that the world would run out of food by certainly before today. And I agree that there was a Cold War context to it, but I also think there was something beyond the Cold War. It was a development and a food security concern. So I think there was a humanitarian concern as well as a security Cold War one. But anyway, even though I think that it is clear that Dr. Ravin Holt was driven by this demographic concern, he also believed there was significant unmet demand by women for smaller families and for contraceptives. While he did not want to invest in demand creation, things like girls' education, economic opportunity for women, and rights for women, he didn't see that as being important. He did implicitly put women at the center of his thinking. And does he deserve any credit or acknowledgement for that? Because implicit in the idea of unmet demand is the unmet demand of women. But sort of enough about kind of heroes and villains, and just a few more thoughts on the book itself. As I said before, I think it's a marvelous history, and is someone who was involved during this period in international development. I think it would have been valuable to at least refer briefly to two pieces of legislation that significantly affected the way the U.S. provided its development assistance. And I don't believe either was mentioned in the book, or at least I didn't see them. First was the Percy Amendment, which passed in 1973, that required U.S. bilateral assistance programs to enhance the integration of women into the national economies of developing countries. So there was movement very early in the 70s on women in development. I think the picture comes through a little bit that it was later than that, and the Office of the Women in Development in USAID was created in 1974. And while no one would argue that those efforts have been tremendously successful, I do think we need to acknowledge that there were extraordinary efforts to try to enhance the roles of women and to integrate women more effectively into development programs. I think the history of that effort on building women into more importantly into the development efforts, I think that history still needs to be written, and the lessons learned from the lack of success recorded, as well as the successes. And I think there were some successes. The second thing that I think would have been good to mention was something called Section 104D of the Foreign Assistance Act, which was voted into law in 1978. It called for USAID to look broadly at the factors that influence families in determining the number of children they want to have. It was looking at the demand side. It cited a number of factors, including increased women's education, increased employment, and incomes for women, improved child health, and more equitable distribution of income. And this legislation required USAID to look much more comprehensively at its programs and to tailor them to the specific needs of individual countries. And it really ended the inundation strategy that the Office of Population had been following. And I might just add, I was also surprised not to see, and maybe this kind of goes as Heroes a little bit. I think that after Mexico City policy was instituted, I think some of the people in USAID and people like Steve Sending, who was the head of the Office of Population, deserves a huge amount of credit for maintaining family planning programs and finding ways to adhere to the law, because as a government official one must do that. As a citizen one must do that as well, I guess. But adhering to the law, but also maintaining programs and even expanding them, and I think they are heroes as well. I think I've probably gone on too long, so I'm going to maybe drop some of my personal observations, but I definitely will. So let me just come to a few final thoughts on reproductive health and the current debate. And most importantly, I hope that we can leave some of the past behind. We ought not to be burdened forever by the debates of the 60s and 70s, as great as those years were for some of us who grew up during them. And I think there are some things we should be able to agree upon. First, we should be able to organize ourselves around a broad women's and reproductive rights agenda. Family planning is part of this agenda, but it's not all of it. We need to, and I may just add parenthetically here, that we need to integrate our attention to women's health. I, over the past couple of weeks, went to a meeting on cervical cancer, and there was a lot of discussion of HPV vaccine and care kits or testing kits. And then a couple of days later, I went to something on microbicides. And we've got to figure out how to deal with, integrate all of these things into women's health and reproductive health and break away from some of these silos. And I feel strongly about that. At the same time, that we believe in the women-centered approach, we cannot deny that population growth rates do affect economies and overall development process. Recognizing that doesn't make one a macro demographer or a population control person. And I think sometimes we're forced to be in one camp or the other. One can still say that population growth does affect the broader development process. And by saying that, one is not a non-supporter of women's rights. And just lastly, that women in developing countries should be at the center of the debate on international aid and reproductive health strategies. And I think, as is clearly illustrated in Michelle's book, their voices are the most convincing, and they need to be defining the priorities and strategies for the future. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Thank you both. That was excellent presentation and great thoughts, Carol. As I said earlier, when we get to the Q&A here, wait for the microphones to come around and tell us who you are so people know. And maybe I'll take the prerogative of the moderator here, and just I think maybe I'd like both your thoughts on this, but maybe Michelle first, since it comes up in the book. You mentioned early on and a few times through the book that security was one of the motivating factors, and it was part of the Cold War strategy almost. The issue of not just population stabilization, but population control and decrease. It then went away, population growth and just sheer numbers went away as an issue and is sort of seen as a soft issue within the security community, but seems to be coming back, at least within some circles. And sort of getting to what Carol was just saying, you can be both pro-woman and pro-female empowerment, but also think that stabilizing population is a good idea for a lot of these macro drivers, whether it's economics or security. And I'm just wondering what you think about how to get these two worlds to play together.
Right.
Since security as an argument seems to be coming back when it comes to population.
Well, yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you that security is coming back, and kind of also scarcity is coming back, right? I mean, I think there's an increasing realization that we're going to run out of water, by 2050. projections show that global population is going to be somewhere between, I think, 9.2 and as high as 10 billion people, depending on, how birth rates evolve in the next few years. And so, even I think it was at the end of 2007 or maybe it was 2008 that Michael Hayden, the head of the CIA, started talking about population insecurity and what it means to have huge numbers of kind of unemployed, unaffiliated men. And I would add that I think that has an even greater salience in countries where you have, either because of sex-selective abortion or, bad child health, which always disproportionately affects girls, where you're going to have lopsided numbers of young men who can't be married because there aren't enough women. That's even a greater recipe for instability. And one of the legacies of these old battles between kind of feminists and population people or family planners that reached its apotheosis at Cairo is that there's all this tension between people whose kind of policy goals are quite similar now. I mean, it's interesting. I was actually talking with an editor at the New Republic about doing a piece about the return of the population factor, and we were trying to figure out where's the fight. You know what I mean? Or what you kind of need for a story, and we were saying, well, what's the difference in what, say, the women's movements and the population people are advocating for? And it's so small at this point as to be kind of almost infinitesimal. I mean, there's no zero population growth voice out there arguing, or any kind of credible voice out there arguing for forced sterilization. There's no one really even arguing for incentives. I mean, there's a pretty good consensus right now that if you are serious about bringing down population growth rates, the best way to do that is through the methods that the women's movement has been championing. And one of the unfortunate things that happened post Cairo is that when it was a national security issue, when it was a future of the planet issue and a food security issue, everybody got involved. Like I was saying, it was something that presidents had to talk about. It was something that was in Time magazine. It was something that was totally part of the public discussion. And unfortunately, such is the world we live in, that once it became about women's rights, a lot of people lost interest, and it kind of faded. Which is unfortunate, but there's also an opportunity there because there are these kind of broader implications. I think that, now that some of those older battles have been fought, there's a lot of room for new alliances, and I think that those discussions are happening, that people are starting to realize that it's not a bad thing to make these environmental arguments and to, make alliances with people on the environmental side, or make alliances with people with national security goals, as long as you make sure you don't backslide on the issue of consent and coercion.
Right. You want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I would just, I agree absolutely. I think we need to stop dichotomizing the two, and particularly as long as women's rights are protected. I found it very interesting because I had always approached the family planning coming from the development side, and it was really only more recently that I got sort of embroiled and understood the issues and the debate. And your book really caused me to step back and think about what was I doing over the past 30 years? Why didn't I understand what was going on? But anyway, it's...
Okay, who'd like to start us off with the Q&A here?
Oh, someone has to be first.
Back there with Michal.
My name is Michal Avni. I'm working in the Office of Population and Reproductive Health at USAID. This has been a really interesting presentation. I haven't read your book yet, and I'm very curious. One thing that I'm wondering about is whether in your book you address this issue of continued investment or lack thereof in research for new contraceptive methods. It's kind of stalled. The U.S., I think, is not investing a lot of resources. I don't think internationally there's a great deal of interest. There's been some research for a male contraceptive pill that has been very slow to provide any real results. So I'm wondering how that factors into your whole argument about control of reproduction and power and where we go from here.
No, I don't really get into that in the book, although I think that the arguments that I make in the book are to some extent the arguments that I would make about why there hasn't been that investment. I mean, on the one hand, like I said, there was just a kind of broad-scale loss of interest. You know, there was the kind of loss of interest in family planning as a kind of global panacea led to a lack of investment in all sorts of things. I mean, it's the reason why, you know, people who've worked in this field for a long time have told me that they go to clinics in, you know, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, especially outside the major capitals, and they said contraceptive supplies are worse now than they were in the 70s. And so, you know, I think it's the same, that we're not investing in distribution and we're not investing in commodities is also the same reason that there hasn't been any investment in better reproductive technology. And then the other part of it is the fact that so much of the money has gone, you know, necessarily in many cases to HIV and AIDS, and also that those two things, in part because of the politics of the Bush administration, have been seen as kind of completely separate, so that, you know, there's been no effort to combine them in a kind of programmatic way. I mean, you see this kind of ridiculous situation when you're traveling around in some countries where you have, you know, the HIV testing and treatment center over here and the family planning center over here. And not only is it a total waste of resources, but it creates all this stigma because you go to this place, it's very obvious why you're going there. Whereas if they were all in one place, you could be going there for any number of reasons. And so I think, you know, again, the fact that HIV has been kind of completely sectioned off from broader reproductive health, and that money has gone there, and that reproductive health as a whole has been, you know, both kind of, well, there's been both kind of disinterest and apathy, and then also, you know, outright hostility from a lot of the government for the last 8 years.
Yeah, up here.
Hi, thanks for the book, which I'm looking forward to reading, and the comments today. I'm Madeline Short. I'm also with the Office of Population at USAID. One of the questions that I had for you is getting back into changing the dialogue and the discourse over reproductive health. The title of your book mentions power, and I think that one of the big issues is that, for example, if we look in the United States at the abortion debate, frequently people who are anti-abortion are also not necessarily pro-contraception, which to me means that it's more of a power issue as opposed to a pro-life issue. And so given that it's a power issue, I'm just not sure, you know, bringing logic to the debate, what will that accomplish?
Well, and it's a power issue in a couple of ways. I mean, not only is it a power issue, you know, kind of domestically and about who gets control of resources, but I think even kind of more significantly, one of the lessons of the last however many years is that whatever kind of technical interventions you make, a lot of times it's the power dynamics within families and within communities that are the real kind of obstacles to better reproductive health care. I mean, you kind of, as long as women don't have the power to decide when they're getting married, or the power to decide who they're having sex with, or the power to demand condom use, you know, kind of all the contraceptive supply chains in the world, you can have some impact. But you fundamentally, I mean, what I think is interesting is that, and what I think the other side, the anti-abortion side and the kind of traditional value side understands, and that maybe the family planning side doesn't like to talk about so much, is that this is really about changing cultures and changing societies. I mean, I think that the global family planning movement I see it as one of the kind of biggest and actually most successful social engineering initiatives in the history of mankind. But you get into really dicey issues if you start kind of objectively talking about, well, how do we change the sexual behavior and the sexual norms of other countries? Which is why I think that the only approach is to see that there's women on the ground struggling mightily to change their societies from within, you know, who believe that their societies are as kind of dynamic as as dynamic and changeable as ours are, and that who's to say that we can't have progress and that somehow that's inauthentic. And there are ways to kind of help them and, support them and show solidarity with them, as opposed to kind of coming in from above and saying you have to change the way you organize the most fundamental relations in your lives. These are, like, I think a lot of times very profound questions, and there's a reason why the empowerment of women and the elevation of women and kind of giving women more autonomy causes so much deep-seated panic and anger in people. It's because these are, these hierarchies, these dichotomies are like at the absolute metaphysical foundation of a lot of how, societies are organized. And it's, there's kind of no greater sign of modernization. There's no greater sign of globalization and urbanization than kind of changing gender roles. So that's why I think so much of the kind of anger and hostility towards changes in the world and towards people feeling like their traditions are spinning out of control are directed at kind of, uppity women. The other thing I would say is that attached to that is why there are certainly people who are against abortion for deep-seated moral reasons, who believe that it's murder, who, people of goodwill. But I have never seen anything to suggest that kind of organized forces are most troubled by abortion per se. There's an inverse correlation between abortion laws and abortion rates. Latin America, some of the strictest abortion laws in the world, the highest abortion rates in the world. Sub-Saharan Africa, second highest abortion rates in the world, also incredibly strict laws. Lowest abortion rates in the world are Western Europe. And I would say that women all over the world deserve abortion rates as low as those in Western Europe. And one thing I think is interesting is that for example, in Colombia, where abortion, although not totally banned, is very highly restricted and only allowed under certain circumstances, everybody knows where the clinic is. I mean, everybody knows where to go for an abortion, but I've never, in all the times, maybe I'm wrong, maybe there are examples, but in all the times I've been researching this issue, I've never seen a campaign against an illegal abortion clinic or a campaign to shut down the underground abortion. It's the approbation. It's the kind of government allowance of abortion that causes outrage, which is why, again, I think it's much more about how society, to the people fighting this, I think it's much more about how society is going to be ordered, what our kind of norms and values are going to be, and and about kind of preserving a traditional idea of the natural order of the planet, or the natural order of society.
Yeah, up here.
Martha Farnsworth-Ritchie, Cornell University. There are some good stories coming out that show that things are moving along. As Carol knows, I was involved in getting the Cairo Consensus put together those 15 years ago, and I've followed along with some of these activities. There's, for instance, new research has just come out that makes it look like we're seeing starting a decline in China, India, South Korea on the sex-selective abortion. And the researchers link it directly to the increase in education of women. And as we know, the research we used to build the Cairo Consensus was showing that connection between women's education, then women's empowerment, and then decisions made with women's health. So I think one thing that maybe another book would be to see how some of these success stories are happening. And also to see where other things are going on now, say in, Carol, your area of economic development, indicating that population's effect on economic development is becoming more problematic where population is particularly dense. Again, new research. On the one hand, and on the other hand, your point, which I think is absolutely true, and I've been working in this area for a long time, it's the the culture shock, the fear of the change into the way things are. Because some of those things that are things that people don't like. Deaths to people they care about, shorter lives, children sent off to war, all kinds of things. There's just a lot. This just keeps moving on.
Yeah, I would actually be curious about the research that you're talking about changes in India in terms of sex-selective abortion. Because I've seen it in South Korea, and I write about that.
This is very new in the current issue of Population Development Review. If you want to look at that, Monica Dasgupta and two other researchers.
Okay, because Monica Dasgupta has done really interesting research about South Korea, and I write about that because
She's extended it now to India.
Because in the past, one of the kind of grim ironies about India is that it's actually been the kind of more educated, richer, more, kind of modern, more urban women, not universally, but actually sex-selective abortion has been most prevalent in the places where you would kind of least expect it. So some of the lowest, so you have really terrible sex ratios, for example, in a Delhi neighborhood called House Cows, which is, this kind of very upper middle class, very posh, very well-educated neighborhood. And it actually, at first, when you look at the facts and the research around India, maybe this has changed, it seems to call into question a lot of our kind of verities about, you educate women, and the education of women and the empowerment of women is all across the board, correlated to better outcomes for their daughters and for girls in general, except on this one issue. And it's really, it's something that's very difficult. And Monica Dasgupta, in this really interesting study of South Korea, had kind of showed that actually attitudes, there's a way in which kind of attitudes and practice can work against each other. So, there used to be a lot of female infanticide, and then people stopped that. Or not people stopped it, but it was, largely wiped out. So attitudes change. So people become, say, more accepting of girls, slowly. But then all of a sudden the technology totally overtakes that, and the access to the technology, which you're more likely to have if you have more money and kind of more, especially as it becomes illegal. And so it takes a while for attitudes to kind of outpace technology. So for a while, it actually looks like the more educated you are, and the more urban you are, the more likely you are to opt for sex-selective abortion, which is one of the kind of ugly paradoxes of this whole debate.
Well, I think in a way this shows that policy does work and policy communications work, because people begin to see different ways of looking at things, and they begin to perceive the consequences of, say, not having so many girls that you need for your society to move forward. Take a look at this. Is her latest research.
Okay.
Yeah, in the back.
Danielle Kuczynski from the Center for Global Development. Just amongst some of the more recent publications that have come out on population, what do you feel is the biggest contribution that your book can make to the discourse?
That's a hard question. Because you don't, as a it was interesting when Gil was introducing me. He was saying, these are academics and policymakers, and I'm neither. I'm a journalist, and you actually don't necessarily write a book to make a contribution to the discourse. You write a book because you see a story that you don't feel like is being told. Part of what I think my book is able to do is to like I was saying earlier, that I see a real divide between the mainstream debate and the debate that goes on at the kind of specialized level, and that a lot of the language that people use at the specialized level is intelligible to just kind of a mainstream informed reader. And so part of what I wanted to do was just translate some of these debates so that someone who is, say, concerned about concerned about international poverty or concerned about women's rights, but doesn't kind of understand the jargon, or doesn't will kind of, it's very accessible, and also I was kind of amazed that it didn't already exist, that nobody had written, kind of a book for general audiences about what I saw as being a pretty sprawling debate. So if there's one kind of contribution that I think this book could make, it would be to to maybe bridge the gap between a general readership and a specialized one.
Okay, well, I think we've run the course of questions, but I think this is really a great discussion, and I really encourage everyone, as has been said 100 times already, but this is a great book, and Carol, thanks so much for bringing out some really interesting points to chew on, and thanks everyone for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you.